The rain that night did not fall so much as it whispered, thin threads of water drawing crooked lines down the soot-streaked windows of the Lower East Side. The gas lamps burned dim, their light catching on the puddles that gathered between the cobblestones. It was November of 1910, and New York felt older than its years, a city of damp bricks, iron stairwells, and the faint, metallic smell of progress. Somewhere between the baker's smoke and the river fog stood a chapel, small and humble, its steeple leaning slightly, as though tired from holding heaven up too long. The bell above it was cracked, its voice softened by time, but every morning it rang anyway, a stubborn heartbeat in a city that had forgotten how to pray. Across the street lived a man named Richard Halberd, a landlord of unremarkable height but remarkable precision. He wore dark coats with starched collars and gloves even indoors, as if the world itself were unclean. He carried the smell of paper and ink, of ledgers and carbon copies, to his tenants. He was less a man than a signature, neat, cold, and final. He believed mercy was a weakness that bred unpaid rent. In his eyes, God's house owed him as much as any tenement, and when the church could no longer meet its lease, he didn't hesitate. On Sunday, while the congregation sang about forgiveness, Halberd prepared the eviction notice. He wrote it with steady hands, as though drafting an invoice to heaven. By Wednesday, the chapel's doors were locked. The priest, Father Dunn, had knelt one last time before the altar, whispering a prayer for his flock, and perhaps for the man who had thrown them out. He left quietly, carrying only a single candle and a worn book of psalms. The flame flickered against the chapel's peeling paint as he passed through the nave, light trembling like something alive. Outside, Halberd watched from the corner, dry beneath his umbrella. He nodded once, as though confirming that justice, at least in his books, had been done. But on Thursday night, smoke began to rise. At first, it was only a faint wisp curling from the roof, the kind that might come from a candle left burning too long. Then came the crack of glass, the roar of something feeding on wood and varnish. Flames climbed the chapel's frame with unnatural hunger, licking the stained windows until the saints' faces melted into molten tears. The smell carried for blocks, incense and ash, mingling like old sins remembered. The tenants crowded the street, faces ghosted orange by firelight. They called for water, for help, for anyone who might still be inside. But the church was empty, save for the fire and its own echo. The city report would later call it an accident, faulty gas lines, old wood, negligence. But witnesses remembered seeing a man near the alley, standing still while the fire raged. He didn't shout or run, he simply watched, his gloved hand trembling at his side, the match still glowing faintly between his fingers before it vanished in the rain. They said he looked as though he was waiting for something, a sign, perhaps, or a forgiveness that would never come. When morning came, the chapel was nothing but a blackened frame. The bell had fallen through the ceiling, twisted in its own metal skin. What remained of its bronze tongue had fused into a shape disturbingly human, as though it had tried to cry out and failed. Children dared one another to touch it, whispering that it was cursed, that it still hummed faintly when you stood close enough to hear. No one noticed the landlord return that afternoon, stepping lightly over debris, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. He carried a notebook and wrote something, as he stared at the ruins. Perhaps it was an estimate for rebuilding, or perhaps he was taking inventory of what the fire had taken from him, something more than rent, something that could not be itemized. That evening, as dusk bled into night, a boy named Samuel, no older than 12, delivered newspapers through the neighborhood. The headlines spoke of the fire, of faulty pipes and the heroism of a volunteer brigade. He stopped when he reached the church's corner, his lantern swaying. There, near the smoking rubble, stood Mr. Halberd. His coat was open, his hands bare. He was kneeling, not in prayer, not in grief, but as though listening to the ground. The boy watched, silent. He would later tell the others that the landlord's lips were moving, but no sound came out. Only when the wind shifted did he hear something faint, a whisper that seemed to come not from the man, but from the soot itself. Samuel dropped his papers and ran. In the weeks that followed, the city forgot. The ruins were fenced off, the reports filed away. Halberd resumed his routine, collecting rents, issuing notices, calculating interest. Yet something in his rhythm had faltered. He began to pause mid-sentence, as if waiting for an echo. He would wake at odd hours and find the smell of smoke clinging to his curtains, though the fire had long been out. The clerks in his office said he sometimes spoke softly to his own reflection, muttering numbers that didn't exist, and when he signed his name, the ink seemed to spread too far, the letters bleeding at their edges like scorched parchment. No one knew that at night. Halberd visited the church ruins. He stood by the bell, his lantern dim, tracing the melted bronze with gloved fingers. The ashes stained his cuffs, dark smudges like fingerprints that no soap could wash away. He told himself he was checking the site, ensuring no vagrants had moved in. But he always left with the same look, the expression of a man being watched by something older than law. He began to keep a candle burning in every room of his townhouse, as if afraid of what the dark might whisper. The neighbors heard him pacing long after midnight, the floorboards creaking like murmured prayers. There were rumors, of course. Tenants whispered that the church's ghost had followed him home, that sometimes the flicker of candlelight in his window shaped itself into a cross. Children dared each other to knock on his door, but none ever did twice. The milkman swore he heard organ music faintly through the walls, though the nearest church stood 3 blocks away, and every morning, the air around his building smelled faintly of smoke, not the smoke of hearth or pipe, but of something once sacred now charred. Still, Halberd never spoke of the fire. He donated a modest sum to the city's relief fund and purchased the empty lot under a false company name. For redevelopment, he told the clerk, but he never built anything there. Instead, he had it paved over, leaving only the foundation beneath untouched, unsanctified. It became a vacant scar between tenements, a space where nothing grew and no child played. Pigeons perched there but never nested. The year turned. Snow covered the ruins like a sheet over the dead. On certain nights, when the wind was right, people said they could hear the bell again, a faint metallic groan rising from the earth, as if something buried refused to rest. Those who heard it crossed themselves and walked faster, but a few stayed, listening, wondering whose name it was trying to speak. In the quiet rooms of his townhouse, Halberd stopped keeping ledgers. He began to write letters instead, not to anyone living, but to something he could not name. He filled pages with apologies that never used the word sorry, with explanations that tried to turn guilt into logic. He would write until dawn, until the ink ran dry and the candle wept wax onto his sleeves. When his maid entered in the morning, she found the letters stacked neatly on his desk, each one signed but unsent. He forbade her to touch them. "These," he said softly, "are between me and the fire." No one ever learned what was written in those pages. They disappeared after his death, likely burned with the rest of his possessions. But one page survived, a scrap found years later among old rent books. It bore a single line in fading graphite. "The Lord forgives, but the flame remembers." And perhaps that is the truest part of this story, that what burns does not always vanish. Sometimes it lingers in the cracks of stone and memory, waiting for the night when someone kneels too close and hears the whisper rise again from the soot. Somewhere beneath the paved street, under layers of brick and time, the ashes still rest, and when the wind passes over them, it carries with it the faintest sound, like a match being struck in the dark. Because even in a city built on progress, the past still glows where no one looks, and some names, no matter how they try to hide beneath ledges and walls, are written only in fire. The winter after the fire arrived early, sweeping through the narrow veins of the Lower East Side, like a reminder that nothing built on sin stays warm for long. The air hung heavy with coal and river frost, and from the street, one might have thought the city itself was holding its breath. Only the faint sound of typewriter keys and carriage wheels broke the stillness, and in one dimly lit office on Broome Street, Richard Halberd began again. The burned chapel had been cleared, and the land now bore the mark of profit. Bricks stacked upon ashes, ledgers drawn over loss. A brewer had come with an offer, a man who spoke little and paid in gold coins that gleamed like trapped firelight. Halberd accepted without hesitation. He told himself that progress left no room for ghosts. He rebuilt quickly, faster than anyone thought possible. Within weeks, The scorched earth was covered by scaffolding, and soon after, the brewery's tall chimney pierced the skyline like an iron finger pointing at God. To the city, it was a miracle of efficiency, a sign that destruction could be turned to income. To Halberd, it was closure, neat and ledgered. Yet as the walls rose, something beneath them seemed to sigh. The workers spoke of odd warmth in the foundation stones, as though the earth still remembered the fire that had fed on it. One man swore he found a melted nail shaped like a cross buried in the mortar. He quit the next day, Halberd, dismissed the stories. Superstition was for the poor. By the time the brewery opened, the smell of yeast and smoke had replaced the faint perfume of incense that once lingered there. But the neighborhood noticed the change. It wasn't the noise or the industry that unsettled them. It was the quiet that followed. Tenants in Halberd's buildings began to complain. They said the walls were colder than before, the kind of cold that no furnace could cure. They spoke of soft music at night, hymns seeping through vents, echoing faintly in hallways. Some said it was the wind in the pipes. Others swore it was voices. Halberd waved them off with a half-smile, his gloved hand tapping the edge of his ledger. "You hear what you owe," he told them once, and that was the end of it. But there were things he couldn't dismiss. The first was the paint. He ordered his caretakers to scrub away the scorch marks that bled through the plaster, but they always returned, faint grey in the shape of arches and windows. He replaced the wallpaper, yet shadows of fire reappeared beneath it. The next was the ink. His books began to betray him. Numbers he'd written the night before dissolved by morning, as though washed away by invisible rain. Some pages bled black at the corners, as if the ink itself had burned. The clerk who helped him draft leases noticed it too. He was a thin young man with shaking hands, and one day he closed the ledger mid-entry and said quietly, "They weep when counted." He never returned after that. Halberd tried to forget the remark, but it followed him. He began locking his books in an iron chest, keeping the key around his neck. At night he would check them again and again, tracing the figures with a finger that trembled despite himself. The gold he earned no longer felt solid in his hand. He weighed it sometimes on the kitchen scale, convinced it was lighter than it had been. When he looked at his reflection in the window, he thought he saw something move behind him, a flicker of smoke, a figure half made of dust. He'd turn, and the room would be empty, except for the ticking of the clock and the faint smell of ash. It was around this time that the record surfaced. A parish clerk, cataloguing documents saved from the fire, sent Halberd a letter requesting payment for restoration. Enclosed was a page from the baptismal register. Its edges charred, its ink half gone. Only one name had survived untouched: Halberd. Richard. He stared at it for a long time, his thumb brushing the burned paper. Beside his name was a note in faded script, one he almost didn't notice. "He will build walls where light once lived." The signature was that of Father Dunn, the same priest who'd been evicted, the one who'd disappeared after the fire. The note was dated 18 years earlier, written on the day of Halberd's christening. He didn't sleep that night. He lit every lamp in the house, opened every ledger, and began checking each figure again. But the numbers refused to align. Columns blurred, the ink spreading like veins across the page. By dawn, his study reeked of oil and sweat. His eyes burned. He told himself it was coincidence, just old paper and bad memory. Yet the words of the priest clung to him, crawling beneath his skin. Walls where light once lived. Days passed. Then weeks. Tenants began leaving without notice. They said the rooms whispered, that when they tried to sleep, the floorboards creaked under invisible weight. One woman told him she woke to find soot on her pillow, though the fireplace had not been lit in months. Another said she saw handwriting appear in the condensation on her window, looping letters that spelled his name. Halberd scolded them, called it foolishness. But when the wind howled at night, he could almost hear the same whisper himself. The brewer's payments arrived on time, heavy pouches of gold that clinked like chain links. But Halberd no longer counted them. He began to spend his evenings alone, the blinds drawn, the lamps dim. He wrote fewer letters, visited fewer tenants. The sound of church bells, any church bells, once made him wince. When he passed the new brewery, he crossed the street without looking at it. Though he had built it himself, the chimney still smoked, But sometimes, when the light struck it just so, the smoke curled into shapes he couldn't name. He began to dream of the fire again, the smell of burning hymn books, the sound of a bell breaking. In those dreams, he always stood in the same place, the doorway of the chapel, holding a match that never went out. Winter deepened. The river froze. The nights stretched long, and Halberd found himself keeping company with silence. He took to reading the newspaper by candlelight, though the articles blurred before he finished them. One evening, he caught sight of his reflection in the window again. The face staring back was his, but the eyes seemed hollow, like they'd been painted over smoke. He looked closer and realized that his reflection wasn't following him exactly. When he moved, it hesitated as if waiting for instruction. For a moment, he thought he saw another figure beside it, faint as a memory, a man in robes, head bowed in prayer. He dropped the candle, and when he looked again, only darkness remained. He told no one. To speak of it would be to confirm it, and he needed his disbelief more than his sanity. He began wearing heavier coats indoors, trying to chase away a cold that lived inside him. He kept a small cross in his pocket, not out of faith, but as a talisman against memory. Yet every time his fingers brushed it, the metal felt warm, as though it had just come from fire. By February, the city thawed, but Halberd did not. His laughter, and when it came, sounded forced, brittle as ice. The tenants spoke of him in whispers now, saying he looked thinner. His color drained. One even claimed she saw smoke rising from his chimney at odd hours, though the house lights were out. He smiled when he collected rents, polite as ever, but his eyes were unfocused, his voice too soft. It was as if part of him had stayed behind in that burned church, counting embers instead of coins. He kept the baptismal record in his desk drawer, wrapped in cloth. Sometimes he'd take it out and stare at the note again, tracing the faded words. He will build walls where light once lived. He thought of all the buildings he owned, the rooms without sunlight, the hallways that smelled faintly of damp stone, the windows that never opened, and he wondered just for a moment if that had been the prophecy all along, that he would fill the world with places where light could not return. By winter's end, he barely recognized the man in his mirror. His hair had grayed at the edges, though months had passed, not years. His smile, once practiced and polished, now twitched at its corners, and when he closed his eyes, he could still see the bell, not whole but melting, human-shaped, whispering his name from the ash. Still he pressed on. Rent was due. The books needed balancing. He clung to the rhythm of numbers, the only prayer he knew, but the ledgers had their own voice now. When he opened them, they exhaled the faint scent of smoke. The ink shimmered in the candlelight like something alive, and somewhere in those pages, between the lines and figures, he could almost hear it, the sound of hymns returning, quiet but insistent, from the depths of the walls he'd built. He was the landlord who owned everything but sleep, and sometimes, in the brief hours before dawn, he wondered which debt would come due first, the ones written in his books, or the one written in fire. And when the wind moved through the vents carrying those faint ghostly songs, he did not listen. He only whispered to himself the lie he had built his life upon, that profit was absolution, that faith was furniture, that the past, once burned, stayed buried. But beneath him, the ashes stirred, and the light, unpaid, unforgotten, began to rise again. The morning air of 1912 was brittle with frost when the men came to tear down what little remained of the church. 2 winters had passed since the fire, yet the ground still smelled faintly of smoke when the snow melted. The crew was small, 5 laborers with calloused hands and hollow eyes, paid to clear a ruin that most had already forgotten. But the past does not burn evenly. Beneath the blackened stone and frostbitten soil, something waited, heavy as guilt and sealed by heat. Their shovels struck metal by noon, a hollow sound. One of them laughed nervously and said it was just scrap, maybe a buried pipe. But as they dug, the outline of an iron box appeared, warped, fused, and glimmering faintly through the soot. It looked less like a safe and more like a coffin that had tried to breathe. When the foreman pried it loose, a rush of air escaped, dry and sour, like the inside of a long-shut cellar. The latch had melted into itself. The men hesitated, Someone suggested leaving it, but curiosity, that old unholy hunger, won as it always does. By dusk, they'd hauled it onto the street, a relic sweating ash, its hinges stubborn with rust. They sent word to the city office, and the archivist, a man named Eddington, arrived with gloves and quiet excitement. He had a love for relics, especially those wrapped in tragedy. "Church fire of 10, he murmured, brushing the soot from the lid. "Every ruin keeps its account." He didn't yet know how literal that was. They cracked it open with a crowbar, the sound splitting the winter air like a bell. Inside, there was no treasure, only paper, charred, blistered, half-fused sheets clinging to one another, as if even in death they feared being separated. Rent ledgers, unpaid bills, fragments of contracts, receipts written in looping ink that had bled into the ash. And among them, pressed flat like a wound, lay a small copper crucifix, melted so deeply into the paper it could never be removed. The archivist leaned closer, squinting. On the topmost page, amid the grey and black, a line of graphite caught the light. Words, scrawled in a hand that trembled yet forced its meaning through the ruin. "Until the ashes spell my name." The foreman frowned. "A sermon note?" Eddington shook his head. "No," he whispered. "A signature." The handwriting was elegant but uneven, the kind of script learned in old schools, and when they compared it later to the property deeds filed in the city's archive, it matched one name precisely: Richard Halberd, the landlord, the man who'd owned the land the church had burned upon, the man still alive. Word travelled fast, though never loud. The papers didn't print it. It was just a rumour passed between workers, between tenants, between the few who still lived near that charred block. They said Halberd had written those words himself, years before, when he bought the property back. They said he'd hidden the ledgers there to bury his debts. Others said it was a confession, sealed by fire. But the truth was simpler and heavier. Those ledgers had belonged to him, the very ones he'd used to tally the rents, to measure lives in columns of pounds and cents. And now in the ruin of a church he'd condemned, they had returned, his scripture written in soot. Halberd heard about the discovery within hours. He didn't speak of it, but the servants noticed the change. That night, he ordered every candle in the townhouse lit. The glow from his windows bled into the street. Gold and trembling, he did not sleep. Those who passed by said they saw him pacing, sometimes stopping at the window as if counting the flames. By morning, his hands were ink-stained, his cuffs grey with soot, though no fire had been lit in the hearth. He told no one he'd gone to the site himself. He had walked the rubble before dawn, when the frost still clung to the iron rails. Anne stood where the bell had once hung. The air there was warm, unnaturally so. He knelt and touched the ground. The soot left dark crescents under his fingernails. 3 days later, the maid found him in his study. He was sitting upright at his desk, pen still in hand, the ledger open to a half-written entry. His eyes were fixed forward, as though reading something no one else could see. The ink on the page had not yet dried. The words trailed off mid-sentence. Behind him, the wallpaper had changed, blackened in long arches that stretched toward the ceiling, curved and pointed, like the shadow of a cathedral rebuilt in smoke. The doctor who examined him said it was heart failure. Quiet. A sudden, the coroner made a note. Soot beneath fingernails. Minor burns along fingertips. No one explained why the room smelled faintly of incense. The press handled it quickly. Local landlord dies unexpectedly. A small column, wedged between market reports, and a notice about new tenement laws. It made no mention of the church, the fire, or the safe. But the tenants whispered differently. They said he had been called to settle his final debt. Some claimed that in the nights leading to his death, they'd heard music drifting from his townhouse, a hymn, soft and broken, echoing like breath through an empty nave. One tenant swore she saw candlelight flickering behind his curtains in the shape of a cross. None of them went near the house again. When the city came to clear the property, they found the desk as he'd left it, the ledger, still open, the ink blot spreading across the paper like a slow bruise. The last entry was dated the night before his death, though no one could decipher it fully. The letters were smudged, melted into one another by moisture or something like heat. Only one phrase was clear enough to read: account closed. In the weeks after, odd things began to happen around the block. During a snowstorm in December, smoke rose from the ground where the church had stood. Thin, grey columns that smelled of oil and myrrh. The fire brigade was called. But when they arrived, there was no heat, no flame, only snow melting in perfect circles, as if from invisible candles. The next night, a passerby heard the sound of pages turning beneath the pavement, soft, slow, rhythmic. He said it was like someone reading aloud in a language he couldn't understand. He moved away the next week. By Christmas, the city had paved over the lot, covering what was left of the foundation. But each year, around the same time, people said the air near the corner carried a scent, something faintly holy, faintly burnt, and when the wind was right, it brought with it a sound. Not quite a song, not quite silence, like the sigh of paper curling in fire. The archivist, Eddington, kept the safe in his office for years. He said he planned to preserve it for history, but after Halberd's death he rarely spoke of it. When he finally retired, he ordered it sealed again and placed in storage, though no record of where it went survives. Some say it was melted down, others believe it was buried under the city records building, where the ledgers still whisper through the walls. There's one photograph left, Eddington standing beside the open safe, the burned papers spread before him like relics of a dark mass. If you look closely, you can see the crucifix still fused to the ledger, its copper gleam dulled to grey. The inscription isn't visible in the image, but those who handled it remembered, "Until the ashes spell my name." Perhaps it was an admission, or perhaps a prophecy, because when the fire took the church, it took his name too, smudged it from the city's records, buried it under soot, but the ashes remembered. They spelled it in smoke, in whispers, in the faint markings on walls that refused to stay clean. And even now, if you walk that street in winter, and the wind shifts just right, you might catch it, the smell of ink and fire. The ghost of hymns beneath the rumble of trolleys. They say the ground there hums at night, a low vibration like a voice trapped beneath the stone. And if you listen long enough, it sounds almost like writing. The city paved over a church. It rebuilt and forgot. But the air keeps the account open. The ledgers of the living and the dead still balance themselves in their own way, by ink or by flame. And when the candles burn low, when the soot settles, when no one remembers the name Halberd anymore, the ashes still will, because some debts once written in fire do not fade with death, and some names, no matter how carefully erased, always find their way back through smoke. When the century turned, the old block that had once burned was nearly unrecognizable. The city had covered its scars in marble and glass, polishing away the soot until memory itself seemed paved over. Streetcars clattered past where prayers had once risen, and in the evenings, the light from electric lamps washed the cobblestones in a brightness that left no room for shadows. But the ground beneath had not forgotten. Beneath the concrete veins of the modern district, the ashes of the church still slept, compact, grey and silent, though silence has never meant peace. When the new church was commissioned, the builders were told not to disturb the old foundations. It was cheaper to shift the plans a few yards east, to leave the past entombed in soil. Yet on the first morning of excavation, the foreman's spade struck something that rang, not the dull sound of rock, but a tremor of metal, a single, hollow tone that seemed to echo longer than it should have. They brushed the dirt away and found it, a curved fragment of bronze, green with age but strong as ever. At first, they thought it a piece of piping. Then they saw the edge, smooth, rounded, unmistakably part of a bell. It took 3 men to lift it. The curve was wide enough to have once crowned the air with sound. Beneath the corrosion, faint lines of engraving remained, and though the years had twisted them, though heat had warped the letters into ghosts of themselves, they still spelled a name, Halberd. The letters rippled through the metal like veins of guilt. Someone made a joke, said it was a landlord's bell, tolling for rent long overdue, but no one laughed for long. The air felt colder after that. The workers were told to move it to the side of the site. The fragment was placed near a wall, half covered by tarp and mud. And yet each morning when they returned, it seemed to have shifted. One man swore he heard it hum during the noon whistle. Another said his tools went missing whenever he looked away. By the third week, half the crew refused to touch it. The foreman, a practical man, ordered it buried again, claiming time was money and superstition was expensive. So the bell was left beneath the new pavement, sealed again under fresh cement and the weight of progress. When the new church finally opened, its bell was crisp and polished, a modern marvel cast from untainted bronze. But the first time it rang, it skipped a note, a pause between the fifth and sixth toll, small, almost imperceptible, but wrong enough that every head in the crowd turned. The priest called it a mechanical issue, promised it would be fixed. It never was. Every evening since, the bell tolls 9 times for the living, and once, less for the dead. The missing note belongs to no one, or to one man alone. The locals began leaving coins by the gate, small offerings glinting in the cracks of stone, pennies mostly, sometimes dimes, always placed in silence. They called it rent for the heavens, a payment for the ground that had burned, and the man who had once tried to own its light. Children grew up hearing that story, the landlord who built over the sacred, who measured prayers in currency, who lit the fire that spelled his name in ash. They whispered that he still walked beneath the new church, ledger in hand, counting debts written not in numbers but in souls. The papers never printed it. Of course, progress does not entertain ghosts. The district grew richer, the brewery long gone, the tenements replaced by offices with tall windows and brighter lamps. But at night, the street still carried a faint scent of old smoke. It clung to the corners of alleys, to the hinges of doors that no longer led to anything holy. The janitors who worked late said they sometimes heard pages turning from the basement, slow and deliberate, as if someone was still balancing the books of the damned. One evening, during a storm, lightning struck the steeple. The bell rang by itself, 10 times in defiance, and the echo rolled down the block like a wave. When the storm passed, the priest found the ropes unbroken, the mechanism untouched. Only the clapper bore a streak of black soot. Though nothing had burned, he wiped it clean and told no one. The next Sunday, he preached about forgiveness. His voice trembled when he spoke the word fire. Years became decades. Photographs of the original fire resurfaced in an exhibition about the city's past. In one image, taken at dawn after the blaze, a figure could be seen standing at the edge of the ruins. A man in a long coat, face obscured by smoke. The curator labeled it unidentified witness. Some said it was Halberd himself, frozen between guilt and awe. Others claimed the figure had never been there until the photograph was restored. But the strangest part wasn't the man, it was the background. Behind him, faint but visible, the outline of the bell, whole and untouched, glowed faintly against the rising sun. People began visiting the site again, not in crowds, but quietly one by one. Tenants from nearby buildings, students from the university, night shift workers returning home. They stood by the wall where the new church met the old foundation. Some left coins, others touched the stone and closed their eyes, as if listening for something only the heart could hear. A few claimed they felt warmth beneath their palms, like the pulse of buried embers. No one spoke the landlord's name aloud anymore. It had become a superstition of its own, a word not to be uttered after dark. The city records still held it, printed in the brittle ledgers of property and debt. But even there the ink had faded in places, the letters eaten away by time. History had written him out, yet somehow he remained, not in memory, but in atmosphere. The quiet between bells, the hush before thunder, the pause where light meets shadow. When the restoration committee inspected the church basement years later, they found the floor uneven. Beneath one tile, they uncovered a thin cavity filled with dust and fragments of bronze. No one could explain how they'd come to be there. The fragments were collected and stored in a glass case at the back of the church. A plaque beneath it read simply, "Remnants of the old bell." But if you stood close enough, if you waited for the light to strike it at the right angle, you could still see the faint impression of letters in the metal. They were not clear. They never would be. But they were enough. In time, even the whispers thinned. New generations walked past the church without knowing. The coins at the gate grew fewer. The smell of smoke faded beneath the perfume of the city's new era. Yet sometimes, late at night, the watchman said he heard footsteps between the pews, slow and measured, followed by the creak of a pen against paper, and once, only once, he swore he saw a man kneeling near the altar, his hand pressed to the ground, as if feeling for warmth that had long since gone cold. When he looked again, the man was gone, and where he had been, no single penny lay in the dust. They say history forgets what people command it to forget, but some stories carve their own shape into the world. The fire had taken the church, the man, the ledgers, and the truth. Yet none of it stayed buried. It rose again in whispers, in the rhythm of bells, in the faint shimmer of heat that lingers in stone long after the flames die. The city built new walls, but beneath them the old story kept breathing, and so it ends. As all dark histories do, not with forgiveness, but with remembrance. The name never reappeared in print. The church never claimed its missing toll. But the air above that block still hums softly at dusk, as if echoing something too heavy for words, because some names are written where no ink can fade, in the smoke, the stone, and the silence of those who watched, and some names only find peace when the truth is told.